very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss our design approach with you. A lot of this material is detailed with support that is based on analytical data. As I go along, feel free to take any notes on factors that you feel are important. I don't have any handout materials, as I think your own notes will be sufficient. Now, let's begin by...
This material is very complete, but are you sure that the audience will be able to understand the detail you've included here?
Look, my job is to report on the technical side of the design. The information is simple if you know anything at all about microcircuits, and I think it's the information that's important. If the audience doesn't know how to listen, that's their problem, not mine.
I've got to apologize in advance for this stuff. You're probably going to find it pretty dull. There's nothing terribly interesting about preliminary studies, but we're going to have to go through them before we can get to the good stuff.
These speakers have all made one mistake in common. Each one of them has made an error in recognizing how critical it is to appreciate and to understand the role of the audience as listeners. One of the most common mistakes I see made as a consultant to the engineering world is the tendency of an individual to begin to think about making a technical presentation by asking the question, what am I going to say? And I think that's a mistake. You don't begin a good technical presentation by thinking about content. You begin by thinking about the audience. Remember that no matter what your occupation is or what the concern is, when you stand in front of an audience to make a technical presentation, the audience is number one in everything that you do. The audience needs, the audience concerns, the audience level of capability, whatever it is they are sitting there for, that is what determines how you approach the presentation, what you say in the presentation. Now that creates a difficulty, because most people don't think of audiences as audiences in the listening role. You notice that we place them in the model about third or fourth element. And that's unfortunate that the model is set up that way, because they really ought to be number one. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of audiences. And I think I want to begin by talking about what we might call the positive nature of audiences. Because they're human beings, they have some characteristics that are going to work in your favor when you make a technical presentation. And it begins with what we call the nature of the audiences being susceptible to the contagion of interest. Now, what does that mean in English? It means that if you're interested in what it is that you're talking about, and if you're genuinely interested in getting it across to an audience, sharing it with them, getting involved with them, they're going to know it. And they're very quickly going to be caught up and themselves be interested in what's going on. You know, it's a strange thing to watch people when a speaker begins to talk, and pretty soon, if you notice the speaker, if the speaker thinks something is dull, it doesn't take very long before the audience begins to think something is dull. So look, start out on the basis of assuming the audience is going to be interested in it if you can give them a reason to do so. Now there's a second element, and that is desire. Now by desire I don't mean passion. That's an entirely different kind of communication activity that we will not talk about here. But I mean the normal, natural human desire of human beings to relate to other human beings. Now like when you bring a bunch of people in and you plunk them down in chairs and you say to them, you are to be here for the next period of time, what choices have they really got? The first choice that the audience will make is to use that time as productively as possible. The preference of an audience is always going to be to get involved in what's going on. to use their brains, in one way or another become either better educated or to be persuaded to find out what's going on, to relate through the content with the speaker. Now, of course, if the speaker won't relate to the audience, then the only other choice for the audience is to attempt to set themselves in that state that is somewhere between awake and asleep, but is really neither one of the two. But when you begin a presentation, the preference of the audience, the desire of the audience, is to become involved in what's going on. And then there's a third positive element to the audience that you need to be aware of, and that is that because they are human beings, they have a certain amount of flexibility. Look, all of us change our minds over periods of time. We can be informed, we can be persuaded, as long as you find the right reasons for us to change our minds. Now, don't ever go into a presentation saying to yourself, I can't win. And look, you've all been involved when people have said around and said, it is a waste of time, they're never going to believe it, they're never going to buy it. You know, there's a problem we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe, you're not going to be interested, you're not going to believe this, that's the way you're going to express it, and sure enough, they won't believe it, and you can say, see, I told you so. You go in with the attitude. It's kind of like the conversational attitude we talked about earlier. Don't go in thinking you're defeated. Go in with the idea in mind is that if you know how an audience can be persuaded, there is that capacity to move or change them. They are flexible. Now, it would be, I think, real nice if we could at this point say, well, that's the nature of audiences and it all works in your favor. Unfortunately, there are some negative aspects to audiences that you need to be aware of. And the first of these is something we call attention span. The average human being has a voluntary attention span of something like, 2 or 3 minutes. And the audience plunked down in the chairs, listen to you for 2 or 3 minutes, and then they're probably going to want to break away and attend to something else, and maybe just for a couple of seconds. Now, it may be that they concentrate or focus their attention momentarily on something going on around you. They may focus attention on other people in the room. They may take a couple of notes, maybe just a matter of shifting the body around a little bit. But it's kind of a breaking away. And I emphasize this to get you to recognize that gaining the attention of the audience in the beginning of a presentation is important, but you've got to constantly regain that attention, constantly bring them back in so that they are relating to what you're saying and the information that you're trying to convey. Now, there's a second negative aspect about audiences that may in the long run be the most serious stumbling block you've got to deal with, and that is that most people in an audience are poor listeners. Now, that's not because they're audience, that's because of the way in which people in our culture are trained. Let me say a couple of things about listening to start with. Listening, like any other kind of communication activity, is a skill. And because it is a skill, it means it can be developed, it can be improved, there are techniques, there are bad habits, you can practice it. There's all kinds of things associated with listening as a skill, but unfortunately, most people don't think of it that way. The second thing about listening is that listening is an activity. I don't know why there seems to be an assumption that a good listener is kind of a sponge that absorbs information. Well, that's not true. A good listener works at listening. That is, it's an active mental process of tuning in with the speaker. And a lot of people are not aware of the fact that they have to work at listening. Then there's a third problem, I think, associated with listening, and that is that listening, although it is a skill, is not taught as a skill. Rarely do you find academic institutions, rarely do you find industries who make any concentrated effort at training people or teaching people how to listen. And what difference does that make? Well, unfortunately, I think that the fact that the audiences are not taught how to listen is going to have a very serious impact on the people who sit at that table. It might make more sense when we talk about listening as a skill if we put it into relationship with the other skills that are associated with what we call communication. The four basic skills that we normally deal with are those of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And think for a minute about the way in which human beings develop their own communication skills. To start with, when you talk about reading skills, they don't even begin those until they're 5 years of age. Now, if you talk in terms of writing skills, even the most basic writing skill doesn't begin until they're 6 years of age. If you talk in terms of speaking skills, yep, the first year. By year 1, they have started to say their first word. But where does listening skill actually begin? Well, we know it begins at least at birth and possibly sooner. So of all of our communication skills, we really have the longest time for the development of listening as a skill. But what do the school systems do? Let's talk about grade levels at which they concentrate on communication skills. Reading, they begin at kindergarten possibly, and certainly on up through high school, grade 12. When you talk about writing skills, somewhere in the first grade on through certainly college, the grade 16 or whatever. We talk about speaking skills, well, they're beginning in the 5th or 6th grade on through the college experience. And the listening skills, where are they being taught? Unfortunately, we don't know. There are a few places where listening is taught in junior high, a few in senior high, and a very few are taught at college levels. So we really end up with the academic world ignoring it. But what about listening in terms of how it's used? You know, in 1929, a study was done by a man named Paul Rankin, and that study has been replicated over and over and over again without a significant change. What Rankin did is he studied communication on the job to determine how much time on the job was spent communicating. He ended up with approximately 50% of all the time was spent communicating. And then he broke that 50% down, and he said how much of that time was used for the reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And he discovered that approximately 16% of the time was spent in reading, about 9% in writing, about 30% in speaking, and 45% listening. Now that, even if we're not talking about listening in the audience circumstance, you've got to recognize listening is a critical factor. If it's critical, and if they're not being trained, what happens now when they sit and listen to a technical presentation? Unfortunately, the audiences have a tendency to fall into what we call some listening traps. And they get caught in those traps time after time. And as a speaker, I think it's important that you be aware of the potential that is associated with your audiences getting caught in their own bad listening behavior. Now, the first of these traps that we talk about is the trap of prejudgment. And that is the tendency of an audience to make decisions about the value of listening to something before they hear it. Now, for instance, the first thing, they have a tendency to prejudge ideas. I have been doing some work with a corporation helping to put together some technical presentations and had a chance to sit in the audience when they were done for real. And I was sitting kind of in the back of the room, and there were two people sitting in front of me. Now, an engineer got up, and he said to start with, well, I'd like to take the next 15 minutes to discuss the wisdom of substituting optical wedges for optical prisms for the establishment of orthogonality in a gimbal gyro. At this point, the guy sitting in front of me turned to the person next to him, and he said, who the hell cares? Now, look, it's possible. Maybe he was in accounting, okay? He doesn't really need to know. But when it gets right down to it, one of the critical factors, as a matter of fact, in that presentation had to do with the reduction of cost. Audiences have the right, by the way, to reject any message they want to reject. But they should reject it after they receive it, not before they receive it. Not only do audiences, by the way, prejudge ideas, they also prejudge people. That is, there's a tendency on the part of human beings to look at the carrier of the message and make a decision in advance about the value of the message before they even received it. Now, we can prejudge people on the basis of any one of a number of things: age, for instance, race, sex, clothing, hairstyle, anything, occupation. That's a big one. A lot of people get caught up in the idea of saying that that occupation would have nothing to say that's of value to me. So you're going to begin with the understanding that a lot of times you as a speaker have to overcome the prejudgment that's already been made by the audience about either the value of the ideas or the value of listening to you as a speaker. Now, there's a second kind of trap that audiences also fall into, even if they get past the prejudgment thing, and that's to talk about their methods of listening. Okay, we all have our kind of favorite ways of doing things. One of the first ones of these, and I think one of the most critical, is what we call combat readiness listening. Now, that's what happens when the audience does not want to hear your message, or they know they're not going to like it. Failure analysis reports, a justification for a cost overrun, a presentation that at the quarterly review when you've slipped schedule by 7 months or something of that nature, and they all know what you're going to come up with, and all they do is listen for opportunities to attack. They're really set into what we call the gotcha syndrome. They're waiting for you to say it, and they say, gotcha. Now, that's your problem, and they're ready to go. Now, the only problem with this is, when you've got your mind mentally set for looking for the weaknesses in a presentation, all of the goodies go right on by. And the positive elements of a message are heard and rejected almost immediately because they're not attackable. Now, a second problem that you can run into in terms of methods, and audiences will do this, by the way, what we call the fact hunters. These are the people who love data. They love numbers of any kind. Give you an example. I was participating in a management training conference put on by Hughes Aircraft, and this was for some of their computer people. And the man in charge of that particular section was giving the kind of the warm-up or keynote presentation. And among other things that night, he used this illustration. He said to his group, do you realize that in the year 1941, the city of New York was using manually operated switchboards for their telephone system? Now, were they using that same system today instead of the highly sophisticated computer interfaces that are currently being used, it would require the entire population of the city of New York just to operate the switchboards. Now, at that point, somebody raised a hand. Got a question? Yes. What is your question? He said, what year was that again? Now, look, who cares what year it was? Make up a year, 1877. Look, the point is, get a mental image, if you will, of this guy sitting in the back. Did you get that? Did you get that? You know, there's the mind. Where is it? It's looking for a number. And in the process of getting absorbed in the number, the idea associated with it gets completely lost. Then you got the response of people who say, I know how to get around that. I take notes. And of course, we have the note takers. And some of you are doing it right now, I'm willing to bet. Now, there's nothing really wrong with note taking as long as you do it correctly. The problem we get into is that it's what we call kind of a student syndrome. It gets so bad that at times you can tell a new hire the first day on the job because when you talk to them, their hands twitch. So they think they ought to be taking notes. Now, maybe that's part of our academic world. But the only problem with note-taking, and I've seen an awful lot of people do it, is that they're attempting to write notes and listen at the same time. And that's really an attempt to engage in two different acts of communication simultaneously. Now, if you know your audience has a tendency to take notes, it's something that you've got to build in and be aware of. Now, there's a fourth method problem that we run into, and that's the very polite people who do not want to let you know that they stopped listening before you stopped speaking. And so they pretend to listen. They give you that listening look. All right, now, if they're really adept, by the way, they can even build in an occasional nod. Now, the only difficulty is if you're not really tuned to this, what's going on, you can make a false assumption. You're up there looking at all these people grinning at you, and you get the assumption, well, we're taking care of this one. It's really swinging it. And nothing is really going on. There's an incredible capacity inside the human brain to tune people out. And oftentimes it's extremely difficult, by the way, to know when someone has tuned you out, especially when you have a number of people involved in the audience. So then we talked about two kinds of traps. We talked about the prejudgment traps that people run into. We've talked about the idea of the methodology traps. We've got one left to consider. The third trap deals with the audience's attitudes towards listening. I think all of you are aware of the fact that your attitude towards any skill is going to influence the way in which you develop the skill, the way in which you use the skill. And certainly that applies to the concept of listening. So the trap of attitude has three characteristics. The first of these is what we call the no-sweat listening syndrome. And that is that we're aware of the fact that almost everybody has some kind of subject matter that is more difficult to understand than other kinds. For instance, I have a lot of trouble with fiscal data. When I listen to someone talk about a balance sheet, profits and losses and cost estimates and all the other things, I don't grasp numbers well. And I know if I'm going to understand it, I'm really going to have to work at it. You know, there are days when I just don't feel like listening that hard. I don't feel like working that hard at listening. And, you know, the danger comes when the speaker makes something sound very, very difficult when in reality it doesn't have to be that difficult. So if you've got a listening audience that hears you start a presentation and what you say at the very beginning makes it sound very complex, they're likely at some point along the line to say, I don't feel like working that hard, and therefore they don't listen. Now, another attitude that people have is that they feel very clearly that they have the right as individuals to react emotionally to what we call trigger words. All right? Now trigger words can have a lot of differences from occupation to occupation and from group to group and so on. I recall once I was giving a seminar for some people who were involved in making the pacemaker things, you know, the things you put in the heart to keep it regularly beating and so on. I have no idea what I was talking about or why, but I happened to make some passing reference to Ralph Nader. And I kept right on going until I looked at my audience, and they were all sitting there going, all kinds of reactions going on. And so finally I stopped and I said, hey, what's going on? And apparently I had missed an article in the paper, the front page that day, that said, you know, buy the product, but they have a tendency to explode, or something of that nature. But that audience, right at that moment, as soon as they heard the words, went off on some kind of an emotional tirade inside. Now, that's fine, by the way, to react. But what are you doing while you're reacting? The audience that begins to say, that's not true, and I can answer that one, and they start this mental process of building up their own responses, they're no longer listening. Everything that they're doing is becoming internalized, and the speaker might as well stop. Now, sometimes you don't know when you've hit a trigger word. Sometimes you can tell. But there are listeners who believe that they can take the time to react, even though it tunes out the speaker completely. Now, the final attitude trap that people get caught into is what we call tripping. Now, this has nothing to do with LSD, by the way. This is an entirely different kind of tripping. It has to do with the difference between the speed of the brain and the speed of the mouth. The human brain is capable of manipulating symbols at somewhere between 400 symbols per minute to 800 symbols per minute, depending on who you believe. And look, the human mouth is never going to make it. The very, very best you can hope for is about 275 to 300 words a minute, and that's with 2 martinis and a tailwind. Now, the speed problem at going too fast is not where the difficulty lies. The difficulty lies with the speaker who says, hey, this is very complex material, and consequently, I believe it is very important that we allow an ample... Now, I cannot do that for very long, by the way, because my tongue has no low gear. But what happens when they're dumping words in at 80 words per minute? That's where the tripping starts. Because now the audience is not using their brain speed to stay with the speaker. They're using it to take little side trips. You know, like, I wonder if the customer's called. Now, that only takes a couple of seconds, and you come right back again. You only missed one word, and it was a preposition, so who cares? The only problem with tripping is occasionally you go out there, and you find a winner, and you stay out there. Now you've got a problem. You can come back a minute later. By then, the speaker has made a transition, is now talking about something else. You don't know what's going on. You turn to the person next to you and say, what's he talking about? And he says, I don't know, he hasn't said. Somewhere along the line, you've got to recognize that although I'm not recommending you talk at any particular speed,